I'm here inside of the Avatar Frontiers of Pandora Pura file, which by the way is available on my Patreon if you wanted to follow along. Totally not necessary, don't worry. What I do is I take some of my favorite screenshots, I give them like numerical tags, and this is just so I can, sit down, learn from them, study them, because I like doing studies. And I make these little circles by the screenshots where one will represent that I've done a breakdown on video and the other will represent me trying to recreate something from it in 3D. Usually I roll a dice or a random number generator to decide on one to talk about, but I think I might just dive in to where I find it interesting. But let's talk about this, because I love the idea of bioluminescence. So in this game made by Ubisoft, it's set in the James Cameron Avatar world, as you probably know. They've put a lot of effort into environment art, and I always thought it was just so impressive. They have this day-night cycle in the game, and as you can see, the content of the vegetation changes in relation to that day-night cycle, which means as night comes along, we get these bioluminescent emissive elements. Now for me, this would be something that would be quite exciting to play with 3D wise, although in the regular 3D space we don't usually get to play with dynamic real-time cycles. Seems more appropriate for a video game, but I can imagine how to do something like this if we're looking at these leaf patterns on the object. Traditionally if it was UV'd, you would have a variety of maps, so you've got your albedo, roughness, metallic, etc. But as well as having your physically based maps, you could also have custom data maps. And those could be black and white, basically just grayscale, where white areas represent something being present and black areas represent something not being present. So we can say that we could do a bioluminescence map. You might also describe that as an emission map. So in theory, as well as having all of your regular PBR maps, you could sit down with your UV mapped object in whatever painting software you like and just paint emission, or if you want to think about it in a more fun way, paint bioluminescence actually onto the object. You could then plug that into the shader, whether it's a custom shader or not, and potentially have a value in the shader that represents your time of day. Maybe it's not your time of day, maybe it's just a value that's the additive influence of the emission map, and this additive influence is controlled by a day and night controller which modifies it on the vegetation shaders. So there's a few approaches that could be taken to doing bioluminescence, but I'd think it's beautiful. One thing I also like is that we can see that there is a sense of volumetricity in the atmosphere, where we have the blending of the light, which then kind of dissolves into, or rather from, a more cyan space to a general blue space. So I think it's really effective how we have this influence coming away from the bioluminescence, rather than just having it as is. Volumetrics make such a large impact. One thing I also like about this is that we have a variability in the patterns. We have dots of luminescence, we have the shape following the curve, but then we also have a geometry where we have these lines. And in a way, I think that's kind of similar to how we would describe the distribution of detail being one of the main elements of environment design, where we have large shapes, medium shapes, and then small shapes, but where you would tend to have, a more active amount of the smaller, slightly fewer of the mid, and then fewer of the large. And we can see that represented in many areas. So again, even coming closer to the frame of the camera, we could be reminded that environmentally, while we have high frequency details, we step up in the scale for different types of vegetation until we get to huge scales. So we can literally look up the gradient of the distribution of scale detail for objects. So if you are going to go into doing environment design, these are just principles to keep in mind. And the combinations of these things is very effective. So even without any graphical rendering technology, if we just think about the mesh space, without any lighting, we know it would look interesting because of the distribution. But with our creative rendering and our limited color palette here, mixed with the volumetrics, they both combine into a nice, cohesive and beautiful environment. Let's take a look at this one to the left. Here we've got a giant skybox, which yes, does look very nice, but we see this distribution in more detail, especially with the variety. We can imagine a pathway going up here, but on one side we have small scale details in high frequency, and on the other side we got something similar, but there is variability between them. So we can see that the nature of the vegetation changes. What we can imagine is that not only does the scale distribution change, but possibly over a gradient, like a space, like the pathway, that the distribution of those distributions may change as well, so that we have different types therein. And if you're really clever, we could say that the difference in the distribution changes as a distribution, but that'd be going a little bit too far. I just think it's nice to be able to stand in a position and see that represented, especially in something that's nicely composed. If we break this down into a few layers, we're going from extremely high detail in the vegetation, mid detail where we start to see the tree line come in, and then looking to the stars above. It's a nice procession, if you will. But this one especially goes to highlight how variation is important, especially basically for thinking about the law of the environment. You can tell a story in the variability, and the story is the evolution of life through time. So yeah, maybe this will be just a short one, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Patreon.com/CodeAssault, or you can find out more on my website at codeassault.online/Patreon or /members, where I have these reference boards and Blender related content. If you made it to the end, put a plant related emoji in the comments so I can see who you are. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.